Well, certainly among the most important events that occurred in the 20th century and that shaped the world that we're all living in right now was the Russian Revolution. We all learned something about it in school. I've got to say, I certainly got the broad outline of it, but not much more. Now, since school, I've read a few books about the Romanov family and the Tsar, and of course, I've seen Dr. Zhivago a few times, but that's about it. Now, I think it's been tough for historians to put together a complete picture of the Russian Revolution. On the one hand, they're stuck with the impact of Soviet propaganda that probably twisted anybody's view of history. And on the other hand, until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, there probably wasn't very much access to Russian sources and archives. That's where this book comes in. It was published a few years ago, and it was written by a man named McMeekin. What it is really a general survey of the period from 1917 to 1922. Although it gives a little bit of background to this period, its main concentration begins with the two-stage revolution in 1917, and it ends with the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922. The two-stage revolution in 1917, of course, involved the overthrow of the Tsar in February, and then the Bolshevik seizure of power in October of that year. Now, jumping to the key event in 1922, the book ends with the treaty between the Russian and German governments, which pretty much plugged the Bolshevik economy into the rest of the world in a kind of a backdoor way. Now, this book has received what I would call mixed reviews. People who know a lot more about Russian history than I do think that it presents a distorted and maybe somewhat unsupported view of events. Other people think it's right on the money. I'm certainly in no position to judge. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to take it exactly as it comes. And what I'm going to do is single out three things in the book that stood out to me. And those three things were key people, key actors, notable events were the ones that got my attention, and then what apparently were the drivers of the revolution. Now, first off, let's take the personalities. The main ones, of course, were Tsar Nicholas, Alexander Kerensky, the man who was the head of the provisional government for a few months in 1917, Leon Trotsky, who did a lot to engineer the nuts and bolts of the Bolshevik takeover, and of course, Lenin, the driving force behind the Bolsheviks. But there were two other personalities who seemed to me to have been quite influential or pivotal in helping the Bolsheviks succeed. The first, and quite frankly, surprisingly to me at least, was the British Prime Minister Lloyd George. He ended the British blockade of Russia's ports on the Baltic Sea and gave Russia some kind of a backdoor into the world trading system to import stuff and export stuff. Now, the other was a guy I'd never heard of before, a Swedish banker. He was named Olav Ashberg. Ashberg was instrumental in getting the Bolshevik government some access to the world banking system, and also tying the Russians in with the German industrialists. McMeekin really doesn't do anything more than to provide brief sketches of these people. Nicholas, of course, comes across as weak and indecisive, a little on the dumb side maybe. Trotsky, very practical and innovative. Lenin, as single-minded and totally ruthless. And Kerensky, he describes as an inexperienced 36-year-old lawyer who was completely out of his depth in power politics. As for Lloyd George, he was apparently a little on the fearful side of the rising labor faction in British politics. And his treatment of Russia seems to have been a kind of a sop to them. Now, Olav Ashberg, the Swedish banker, was apparently driven by some sort of a combination of some left-wing sympathy and, I'm guessing, just plain greed. Apart from personalities, I was particularly struck by several events that McMeekin describes. The first of these was Kerensky's decision to rehabilitate the Bolsheviks in the summer of 1917. At that point, he actually had them on the run. In fact, Lenin had been forced to flee to Finland, but Kerensky was afraid of some right-wing factions that he thought ended to restore the Tsar, or at least take him out of power. He restored the Bolsheviks in order to block these other guys. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. Had he not rehabilitated the Bolsheviks, they would never have succeeded in the October Revolution, or so McMeekin says. The second event that struck me was the complicated diplomatic maneuvering that ended up in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I can't begin to summarize what went on, but fundamentally, the Russians said, "We give up." And the Germans said, "Not so fast." Amazing. You have to read it to believe it. And the third event, well, it's actually a series of events, was all the steps that were involved in the total destruction of the Russian economy and Russian society in the period between October 1917 and 1922. I was struck by the sheer speed and brutality of this whole thing. A lot of people died. A lot of people died. It sounds like it was just awful. All right, I talked about personalities and events. Let me talk about what seemed to have been the main drivers behind this revolution. The first one that seems to have been a main contributor, or McMeekin so argues, to Bolshevik success was money. Money seems to have driven everything. And of course, it was German money. Now, not only did the Germans finance Lenin's return to Russia from Switzerland, but they also apparently bankrolled Bolshevik operations and propaganda throughout 1917. Even permitting Lenin to hire rent-a-crowd mobs in Petersburg and to mount a huge and very successful propaganda campaign. Now, all that was instrumental in overthrowing the provisional government. McMeekin spends a lot of time pointing to the different sources that the Bolsheviks used to finance the revolution, and then the government, including the Red Army, after this. That included Russian gold reserves, savings, valuables held by the church in Russia, by the Tsar, and so on. And people say money is the mother's milk of politics, and McMeekin clearly makes the case for this with the Bolsheviks. After money, there seems to have been a significant element of chance in this whole thing. For example, had the Tsar not left for the front until a day later, things could have been different. Had his train returning from the front taken a little bit different route, things would have been different. And there were plenty more chance events that McMeekin describes that I'm simply not remembering right now. But they all came together to produce this revolution. Now, you'll notice I haven't mentioned ideology or public discontent as a driver. The impression I have after reading this book is that it wasn't either of those things. It was a simple drive for power by the main actors. All these guys wanted power. But I guess nothing surprising here. It seems to me that's what drives most politicians, no matter what persuasion they are. The difference was that Lenin was more ruthless and more relentless than most. He had a simple message, and he was lucky. On these points, the importance of German money, the happenstance of chance, the non-impact of ideology, they seem to be the things that have opened McMeekin and this book to some criticism. Like I said before, I'm in no position to judge. I'm not surprised that any historian adopts kind of a point of view in his book. And I think McMeekin is entitled to his. In the end, I'm going to recommend this book. I feel like I got a good framework for understanding what took place, a little more detailed than I had before. And I got some suggestions for things that might be worth a closer look. And that's what I expect from this kind of history. So there you have it. Sean McMeekin, The Russian Revolution, A New History. Sunday mornings, I publish a review of a book that I think is worth bringing to your attention. Here are links to some of my other ones.